The airport terminal buzzed with activity, a sea of people hurrying in different directions, each with their own destination, their own purpose. Among them walked Jamal, a black veteran in his mid-30s, wearing a simple but sharp outfit, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. He moved with a quiet confidence, his gaze focused ahead, unfazed by the noise around him. He'd done this hundreds of times, traveling from place to place, never really settling down, never really belonging anywhere. Today, however, felt different. There was a subtle weight in the air, something that made Jamal feel like he was being watched, though no one said a word. As he walked toward his gate, his footsteps echoing off the shiny floor, he couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was going to be different. Maybe it was just his imagination, but Jamal knew that sometimes it wasn't what was said but what was left unsaid that mattered the most. At the gate, a woman in a uniform greeted passengers with a polite smile. Clara, she was called, judging by the name tag on her chest. Jamal handed over his boarding pass, expecting the usual courteous exchange. But Clara's smile was cold, almost forced, and her eyes flickered over him in a way that made him feel small. Her gaze lingered a little too long, as if she was trying to figure him out. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice hollow, before quickly turning her attention to the next passenger, dismissing him as if he was just another name on a list. Jamal paused for a moment, wondering if he had imagined it, but then shrugged and made his way to board the plane. He could feel Clara's eyes on him as he walked past, though she didn't look up. She just stood there, a cold silhouette at the gate, watching him leave. Inside the plane, Jamal found his seat by the window, sliding into the narrow space and stowing his duffel bag above. The usual routine settled around him. The quiet murmurs of other passengers, the soft clicks of seatbelt fastenings, the scent of recycled air. He looked out the window as the plane taxied toward the runway, his mind drifting to memories of his time in the service. It had been years, but the lessons from those days, discipline, focus, determination, had stayed with him. But even as the plane started to ascend into the sky, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He caught Clara's reflection as she moved down the aisle, but her glance was quick, almost like she was trying not to look at him. She passed by without a word. Her steps hurried, and Jamal wondered if he had imagined the tension in the air, the subtle coldness between them. The flight was uneventful at first. Jamal settled in, resting his eyes for a moment, trying to drown out the noise of the cabin and the weight of the stairs he felt lingering on him. But then Clara appeared again, standing at the aisle, a clipboard in hand. She glanced down at Jamal's seat and then back to the rest of the cabin, as though she was checking off something in her mind. When she saw him, her eyes flickered with something. Not quite fear, but something close to it. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice suddenly sharp. "Can I see your boarding pass again?" Jamal blinked, surprised by the sudden request. It was unusual, but not unheard of. He pulled it from his pocket and handed it over without thinking. She took it, inspecting it for a moment before glancing up at him again. There was no apology, no explanation, just a brief, cold nod before she turned and walked away. Jamal stared after her, his brow furrowing. He hadn't done anything wrong, nothing to warrant suspicion, but the way she looked at him left an unsettling knot in his stomach. The flight continued, but Jamal couldn't relax. He watched Clara walk by every so often, never meeting his gaze, always too busy with something else. Her actions seemed so calculated, so deliberate. Was it just him? Or was there something off about the way she was acting? Later, as the flight settled into its routine, Clara made another pass down the aisle, this time stopping just beside Jamal's row. He watched her from the corner of his eye, noticing that she lingered there a little longer than necessary. She looked up at him for the first time in what felt like hours, but it was a glance filled with something Jamal couldn't quite place. "Is everything okay?" Jamal asked, his voice steady but with a hint of confusion. Clara didn't answer immediately. She just nodded, her lips pressing together in a thin line, before walking off without a word. Something about that exchange felt wrong. Jamal felt the unease tighten in his chest, but he tried to ignore it. He didn't want to cause a scene. He just wanted to get to his destination, the last leg of a long journey home. But as the flight went on, he couldn't help but notice the strange looks he was getting from the other flight attendants. Clara's glances were colder now, more deliberate. She spoke to her colleagues in low voices, casting him occasional, furtive looks when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Jamal's thoughts began to race. He had seen this before, felt it before, the kind of silent treatment that spoke volumes. He had never been one to back down. But this was different. This wasn't just a feeling of being watched. This was something worse. Something he couldn't quite define, but something that left a chill in his spine. He was a man used to adversity. He'd faced enemies both foreign and domestic, but now he found himself fighting an invisible one, something much harder to confront than any enemy soldier. And for the first time in a long while, Jamal began to wonder if he would make it through this flight without something going terribly wrong. As the flight neared its destination, the tension in the cabin was thick, almost palpable. Jamal could feel it growing stronger, and he knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about a seat or a flight. It was something bigger, something far darker. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Clara's voice coming through the intercom, announcing that the plane would be landing soon. But instead of feeling relief, Jamal felt a sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach. He didn't know what awaited him on the other side, but it was clear now. This was only the beginning, and whatever was coming, Jamal would have to face it head-on. He tightened his grip on the armrest, bracing for the unknown. The plane began its descent, and Jamal's mind raced, wondering just how much further this strange, uncomfortable journey would take him. As the plane descended toward the airport, Jamal's mind was swirling. The steady hum of the engines and the slight pressure change in the cabin only added to the tension he felt building in his chest. He wasn't just dealing with a routine flight anymore. It was as if an invisible force was pushing him into an unknown conflict, something deeper than any turbulence he had ever experienced. He watched the clouds part as the plane dipped below them, revealing the sprawling cityscape beneath. The ground felt far too close, too real, and Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The voices of the flight attendants in the galley grew more urgent, but their conversations were too quiet for him to catch more than fragments. Clara's figure passed by his row again, this time stopping just long enough to look down at him. Her eyes met his for a fleeting second, then quickly darted away. Jamal tried to read her face, but there was no remorse in her expression. Instead, there was something colder, a kind of resolve that made him feel even more uneasy. He tried to focus on the ground below, the city growing clearer as they neared the runway. But the moment of calmness that usually accompanied a descent wasn't there. The usual reassurance of seeing home on the horizon felt hollow. He felt like he was still miles away, suspended in something else entirely. The seatbelt sign dinged above him as the plane touched the ground. Jamal unbuckled his seatbelt and began to gather his things. His mind was still racing. There was an overwhelming sense of finality about the situation, as though something would end the moment they landed. What he wasn't sure of yet, but he could feel it creeping closer with every passing second. The flight attendants moved quickly down the aisle, preparing for the deboarding process. Jamal noticed Clara was no longer focused on her duties. Her eyes were fixed on something else now, on him. She was speaking to another crew member, her voice too low for him to catch any words. The unease was becoming unbearable. Every step she took, every gesture felt like it was designed with intent. An intent that had nothing to do with customer service. As the plane finally came to a halt at the gate, Jamal stood, slinging his duffel bag over his shoulder and making his way toward the exit. He walked steadily, but there was a strange weight to each step, like the air was getting thicker the closer he came to the door. Just before he reached the aisle, he saw the uniformed officers waiting near the jet bridge. At first, he thought they were just part of the routine, security checking for any concerns. But then he realized their eyes were on him. They weren't just there to welcome passengers. They were waiting for him. His stomach tightened as he approached the door. Clara's eyes followed him, sharp and assessing, her gaze unyielding as he neared the officers. The weight of her stare felt like an accusation. "Sir," one of the officers said, his tone polite but firm. Please step aside. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He didn't speak, only raised an eyebrow as he turned to face them fully. Was this some kind of mistake? Was he being pulled aside for random security checks? Or was there something more to this? He opened his mouth to protest but was cut off by the officer's next words. "We need to speak with you, sir," the officer said. His voice calm, but there was an undeniable edge beneath it. Jamal felt his pulse quicken, his instincts flaring to life. Something was wrong. He had done nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to warrant being stopped at the gate. Yet here he was, surrounded by security, eyes on him like he was the one who had done something wrong. Clara stood just behind the officer, her expression unreadable. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't explaining herself. She was just watching, waiting for something. Her lack of emotion made Jamal's discomfort grow. He felt cornered, trapped in a scenario where he had no control. "Is there a problem?" Jamal asked, trying to keep his voice calm, though there was an edge to it now. His chest was tight, and his mind was racing, trying to piece together the chain of events. What had she said to them? What was the real reason for this? The officer didn't answer directly. Instead, he gestured for Jamal to follow him. The second officer remained silent, their presence heavy as they led him off the plane. Jamal's eyes flicked back to Clara one last time, her gaze piercing and cold. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a routine security check. This was something far worse. She had orchestrated this, and now he was caught in the middle of it. As Jamal stepped off the plane, he heard a soft murmur from the other passengers who had already exited, but none of them looked at him. Some avoided eye contact, others turned quickly, as if pretending they hadn't noticed the officers escorting him away. His footsteps echoed in the hallway, a lonely sound that felt louder with each passing second. The officers led him to a small holding area near the gate, and Jamal was instructed to sit. They didn't handcuff him, but the threat was still there, looming over him. Jamal sat down in the chair, the cold metal pressing against his legs. He folded his arms, trying to remain calm, but his mind was racing with questions. What did Clara say to the officers? Why was he being treated like this? The questions swirled around his head, but no answers came. He glanced at the officer nearest him. The man was flipping through a notepad, not acknowledging Jamal's presence. "Are you going to tell me what this is about?" Jamal finally asked, his voice tight. The officer glanced up at him, his face expressionless. "We're just following procedures, sir. Please remain here for a moment." Jamal didn't answer. He simply leaned back in the chair, his mind still whirling, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. It didn't make sense. This was his right. He had done nothing wrong. But here he was, isolated and unsure of what was to come. Outside the room, the sounds of the airport continued, passengers moving past without a second glance. But Jamal knew something was happening. He could feel the eyes on him. He could feel the narrative already beginning to form. A narrative he had no control over. The silence in the holding area felt suffocating, and Jamal began to wonder just how long this would take, or if they even planned to let him go. Had he just become the story? He tried to breeze through it, but the uncertainty was gnawing at him. His mind raced. He had to do something, had to find a way to make this right, or at least make them listen to him. As the minutes dragged on, Jamal knew this wasn't just about the flight anymore. It was bigger. He was a veteran, someone who had given years of his life to serve his country. But now, it seemed like the very country he had fought for was turning its back on him. The door to the holding area creaked open, and a second officer stepped inside. Jamal's gaze shifted up, preparing for whatever was next. But instead of words, it was the look in the officer's eyes that struck him the hardest. There was no empathy there, only distance, and that distance was exactly what he would have to overcome if he was going to get out of this. The real battle was just beginning. The air in the small holding room seemed to grow thicker with every passing minute. Jamal had long stopped trying to make sense of the situation. The minutes stretched endlessly, the silence oppressive, broken only by the occasional shuffle of feet in the hallway. The longer he sat there, the more the uncertainty gnawed at him, threatening to unravel his thoughts. The officer who had entered the room took a step toward him. Jamal could feel the tension in the air, stick like fog. His fingers tapped the edge of the metal chair in an unsteady rhythm. Clara's eyes, that icy gaze from moments before, seemed to linger in his mind, fueling the quiet rage that was starting to build in his chest. He wanted answers, needed answers, but none were coming. The officer cleared his throat, his eyes scanning Jamal's face with a practiced indifference. "Sir," the officer began, his voice neutral but firm, "I need to ask you a few questions. We're just trying to understand what happened on that flight." Jamal didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned forward in his chair, his posture defiant. He wasn't about to let himself be cowed, not after everything he'd endured. After all, he'd spent years in uniform, facing far more dangerous situations than this. "What happened on the flight?" he finally repeated, his voice tight with restraint. "I did nothing wrong. What's this really about?" The officer looked at him, then nodded as though he had been expecting this question. "It's standard procedure, sir. We were just notified that there was a concern raised by one of the flight crew members. Something about your behavior." Jamal's jaw tightened, his pulse quickening. "My behavior? What did she say?" He was barely holding back his anger now. "What did Clara say about me?" The officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. His eyes flicked over to the door as though expecting someone else to step in at any moment. "It's not about what she said. It's about what we need to follow up on," the officer replied evasively. "No," Jamal snapped, standing up abruptly, the metal chair scraping against the floor. He towered over the officer, a sense of urgency flooding through him. "What did she say to you? Why am I being treated like a criminal? I've been nothing but polite this entire time." The officer took a step back, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Please, sir, calm down. No one's saying you did anything wrong, but we're just doing our job here. We need to sort this out." Jamal shook his head, his frustration building into something more primal. "This isn't just about sorting things out. You're treating me like a criminal based on nothing but her word." There was a tense silence as the officer stood there, unsure of how to proceed. Jamal's mind raced, the anger and confusion threatening to spill over. He knew this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was part of a bigger, ugly picture. He could feel it. "You don't even know me," Jamal continued, his voice quieter but no less intense. "You don't know who I am or what I've been through, but you're willing to listen to her, to take her word over mine without question. That's the problem, isn't it?" The officer's eyes softened for a brief moment, but only for a second. "So, we are just trying to do what's necessary," he said again. But the words felt empty now, like they had lost all meaning. Jamal could feel the reality of the situation setting in. They weren't going to listen. Not now. Not unless he made them. The door to the holding area opened abruptly, and a second officer entered, accompanied by a stern-looking man in a suit. The man's expression was unreadable, his eyes scanning Jamal with an unsettling intensity. "What's going on here?" the man asked, his tone clipped, as though he was impatient with the situation. The officers exchanged glances but didn't speak. The suited man turned his gaze back to Jamal, studying him from head to toe. "This is the gentleman causing a distraction?" he asked, his voice cool, dismissive. "We received a report that he was behaving strangely on the flight." Jamal took a deep breath, his fists clenched at his sides. He felt like he was about to explode. "I wasn't behaving strangely. I was just sitting there, minding my business, when one of your flight attendants decided I needed to be moved for no reason. And now I'm here, being treated like a criminal." The man in the suit didn't flinch at Jamal's outburst, but his eyes narrowed. "That's not how it's being presented to us," he said coolly. "We were told there was a potential threat, that you weren't cooperating." Jamal couldn't help it. He laughed, but it was bitter, the sound harsh in the room. "A threat? Cooperating?" he scoffed. "With what? Moving to another seat? I didn't even know what was happening. And now you're all in here treating me like I'm a criminal. Because of her word. That's what this is. A flight attendant gets uncomfortable, and I'm the one who gets dragged through this." The man in the suit remained silent for a moment, his expression cold. "We'll need to review the flight security footage, of course," he said, as if that would somehow fix everything. "In the meantime, You'll remain here until we sort this out." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he wanted to scream, to demand that they listen to him. But he could already feel the walls closing in. No one cared what he had to say. It didn't matter that he was a veteran who had served his country with pride. It didn't matter that he had done nothing wrong. The story was already being written, and there was nothing he could do to change it. But one thought kept echoing in his mind. "I'm not just going to sit here and take it." He was determined now. He wasn't going to let this define him. Not this time. Outside the room, the bustle of the airport continued. Passengers were still coming and going, unaware of what was unfolding just a few yards away. Jamal's mind raced with all the things he could do next, the ways he could force them to listen. He couldn't let this slide. His thoughts were interrupted when a voice came through the door. Faint at first, but growing louder. "We've got to do something about this. We can't just let this go." Jamal's ears perked up. That was someone else, someone outside the room. It was a voice he didn't recognize, but it sounded like it was coming from a place of urgency. Jamal stood up and moved closer to the door, trying to make out the conversation. "He doesn't deserve this. He's been wronged. We need to fight this." The door to the holding room creaked open, and Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He barely had time to process what was happening before a tall man stepped inside. A lawyer, by the look of him. The stranger moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Jamal. His sharp suit and confident posture screamed that this man wasn't here by accident. The lawyer's presence was like a breath of fresh air. The officers, who had been tense and unfocused, seemed to stiffen at the sight of him. Jamal could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Someone was finally on his side. The lawyer didn't waste time. He approached Jamal, his face kind but no nonsense. "Are you all right, Mr. Harris?" the lawyer asked, his voice calm but insistent, as though this were a routine part of his day, though Jamal could tell it wasn't. "We've been following the situation, and we need to get you out of here." Jamal blinked, still processing the sudden turn of events. "Who are you?" His voice was a little hoarse, but there was relief mixed with the confusion. "How do you know my name?" "I'm David Anderson. I was contacted by someone who witnessed the incident on the flight. They called me when they saw what was happening to you." David's voice was firm, but there was a trace of empathy beneath it. "I'm here to represent you." Jamal's mind raced. He didn't know who had called this lawyer, or why, but the fact that someone had witnessed the injustice and taken action was a sliver of hope he hadn't expected. He stood up, unsure of how to respond. But the feeling of validation slowly began to settle over him. "You don't have to do this," Jamal said, his voice cracking with emotion. "It's not your fight." David looked at him sharply. "Yes, it is." His tone brooked no argument. "Racism isn't just an issue for the person it's happening to. It's an issue for everyone. I'm not going to stand by and let this go unnoticed." The words hit Jamal like a wave of clarity. For a moment, he was speechless. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Like his fight was their fight. Like he wasn't alone in this. The two officers exchanged uneasy glances as David turned his attention to them. The tension in the room thickened, but David didn't falter. "I would like to speak to your supervisor," he said, his voice smooth but commanding. "I believe you've detained my client without just cause. I'd like to see the evidence you're basing this on." The officers remained silent for a moment, their discomfort palpable. One of them shifted on his feet, but the other officer simply nodded. He stepped outside the room, presumably to fetch the supervisor. The air seemed to crackle with the uncertainty of what was to come. Jamal stood still, his hands clenched into fists by his sides. The quiet rage that had simmered inside him now burned hotter. This wasn't just about his treatment, it was about what this said. Not only about the system he had trusted, but also about the way others saw him. He couldn't shake the memory of Clara's cold gaze, the way she had made a decision about him without ever speaking to him, without ever giving him a chance. David sat down across from him, his gaze softening. "Tell me what happened," he said gently, his voice a grounding force amidst the turmoil. Jamal took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. For a moment, he didn't speak. Just lost in thought. But then the words began to spill out, slow but steady. "I boarded the plane like I always do," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. I didn't even do anything to draw attention. But something about the way Clara looked at me, it wasn't right. She kept avoiding me, like I was some kind of threat. And then she asked me to move. When I refused, she went straight to the crew, whispering about me. I didn't understand it, but I didn't want to cause trouble. I just wanted to get home. Jamal paused, his throat tightening as he relived the moment. And then the police came. They didn't ask me anything. His voice cracked, and he struggled to continue. They just treated me like I was guilty, without even knowing why. David listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable but attentive. When Jamal finished, the lawyer sat back, his fingers steepled in front of him as he processed the story. "This is an all-too-familiar story," David finally said, his voice low. "But that doesn't make it right. No one should be treated this way, especially not a veteran who has served this country. You have every right to stand your ground. And I'm here to make sure you don't walk away from this feeling like you have to shrink into the shadows." Jamal took a long, shaky breath, feeling the weight of those words settle on him like a protective blanket. It wasn't just about the flight or the cold, suspicious looks of one flight attendant. It was about the bigger picture, the things that were so ingrained in society that people didn't even notice them until they were slapped in the face with the harsh truth. "Thank you," Jamal whispered, his voice hoarse, the emotion rising in his chest again. "I don't know what I would have done without you." David smiled softly. "That's why I'm here. No one should have to fight these battles alone." The door opened again, and a man in a uniform stepped into the room. His name tag read, Officer Daniels. His expression was professional, but there was a hint of wariness in his eyes as he surveyed the situation. "I'm Officer Daniels," he said, his tone businesslike. "You're Mr. Harris, correct?" Jamal nodded, standing up from the chair as the officer approached. The tension was thick, but this time, Jamal felt something different. He was no longer the lone figure caught in a web of suspicion. He had someone on his side, someone willing to fight. "We've reviewed the situation," Officer Daniels continued, his eyes flicking to the lawyer briefly. "We've been told there's a misunderstanding and that we should let Mr. Harris go. We'll be issuing a formal apology, and you're free to leave at your convenience." Jamal blinked, not quite believing what he was hearing. This was moving far faster than he had expected. He turned to David, whose expression remained calm but satisfied. "You're free to go, Mr. Harris," Officer Daniels said again, this time with less formality in his voice, as though a burden had been lifted. Jamal could hardly believe it. A part of him still wanted to demand more, to ask how they could think this was just over, that the apology was enough. But another part of him, the part that had been beaten down and forced into submission for too long, wanted to walk out of this room, take the small victory, and leave. He had already paid a price. "Thank you," Jamal said, his voice finally steadier, though still tinged with a lingering bitterness. "But this doesn't end here." David nodded, his eyes full of understanding. "It doesn't end here. We'll make sure of that." Jamal stepped forward, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. But one thing was clear. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. There was too much at stake. Too many people who had suffered in silence, just like him. As he walked out of the room, the doors closing softly behind him, Jamal felt the weight of the moment settle in. He had survived this round, but there were still battles ahead, and he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Jamal stepped out of the airport's automatic sliding doors and into the bright sunlight. It felt surreal. The world beyond the airport seemed so ordinary, so unchanged, but for him, everything had shifted. The day was warm, the sky a perfect blue, but the weight on his shoulders hadn't lifted. If anything, the injustice he just faced only made the weight heavier. As he walked toward his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't over. Yes, the immediate threat had passed. He was free to go. But the world he'd just encountered, the coldness of Clara, the indifference of the officers, made it clear that the struggle wasn't about just one encounter. It was about something far larger, something that had seeped into the fabric of the system. David, the lawyer who had come to his aid, had promised him that they would keep fighting, that they wouldn't let this go. But as Jamal slid into the driver's seat of his car, A sense of uncertainty washed over him. Was it really enough to just keep going, to fight a battle like this one person at a time? Wasn't it all just a piece of a much larger puzzle that no one seemed willing to fix? He started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, the city spreading out before him. The weight of the experience still hung in the air. It was a tangible thing, pressing against his chest as he drove. Every intersection felt like a reminder of the world he had just stepped out of, the one that still saw him as something to be wary of, something to be treated with suspicion. He hadn't signed up for this fight when he joined the military. He had served because he believed in something greater than himself. But now, he realized, this fight wasn't just about honor and duty. It was about survival. It was about identity. And that fight, the one that had been forced on him, was just beginning. Later that evening, Jamal sat in his modest living room, the weight of the day still heavy in his bones. The lawyer, David, had kept his word. He had sent Jamal documents and started preparing the legal action to ensure the incident wouldn't just slip under the rug. But still, the exhaustion in Jamal's mind refused to fade. He glanced at his phone. A message from Marcus, a close friend and fellow veteran, flashed on the screen. Marcus had been following the story and was more than eager to catch up. "I can't believe it, man. I saw what happened. You all right?" Jamal tapped out a quick reply. "I'm fine. I synced. Still processing everything." Minutes later, Marcus called. Jamal answered, pressing the phone to his ear. "You got?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with concern. "I saw the footage. What happened with the Cox? That didn't look right." "It wasn't right," Jamal replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "I'm not sure how I'm feeling right now. Part of me wants to scream, to demand justice, but another part of me is just exhausted." Marcus sighed on the other end. "I get it, man. I know exactly what you mean, but you've got to keep pushing. You can't let them win." Jamal nodded, though Marcus couldn't see it. "I don't know if it's about winning. It's about being seen, about making sure this doesn't happen again. You saw what happened today. Clara, the Cox. It was like I didn't even exist. It wasn't just one person's decision. It was the system." "Yeah, man. It's deep. But that's why we need to keep fighting. Not just for you, but for everyone else who gets caught up in it." There was a long pause as Jamal let the words sink in. "It's hard, Marcus. Fighting this fight. I'm not sure it ever stops. But I'm not backing down, not now." Marcus let out a short laugh. "Good. That's what I want to hear. I've got your back. Always. And you're not alone. We've got to make them see what they're doing." Jamal sat back on the couch, rubbing his hand over his face. The conversation had been comforting, but the truth remained. Nothing about this would be easy. It wasn't just one flight, one bad encounter. It was part of a pattern that had existed far too long. "Thanks, Marcus," Jamal said quietly. "I'm going to need that support. All of it." "You got it. We'll make it through this." Marcus's voice was firm, but Jamal could hear the weight of the world in it too. They both knew the fight wouldn't be easy. After they hung up, Jamal sat in the silence of his living room, staring at the dim light coming from the window. He knew it wouldn't be long before this moment turned into something bigger. This wasn't just about one racist flight attendant or one unjust encounter. This was about a broken system that needed fixing. And Jamal knew, deep down, that it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the people who didn't have the voice or the courage to speak up. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was David, the lawyer, following up. "We've made progress. We started talking to other witnesses from the flight. I'm pulling together a statement, but we need to act quickly. The narrative is already being shaped, and we need to ensure the truth comes to light before it's buried." Jamal sighed and read the message again. He wasn't surprised. He knew that this would become a media circus, with everyone taking sides, twisting the story however they saw fit. The question was, how far would he be willing to go to make sure that his voice was heard? To make sure that the truth wasn't just buried under layers of misinformation? He stood up and walked to his front door, his feet carrying him to the small porch. As the cool night air washed over him, Jamal closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. There was no going back now. He had no choice but to keep moving forward. In the distance, the city was quiet, but Jamal knew it was just a temporary calm. He had already seen the storm brewing, and he had to be ready to face it head-on. The truth had to be told. The fight had to be won. But what he didn't know was how far he was willing to go, how much he would sacrifice, and what he might lose in the process. As Jamal stood there, looking at the night sky, he heard the faint hum of a car engine approaching. His heart skipped a beat as a black SUV pulled up to his driveway. The tinted windows made it hard to see who was inside, but one thing was certain: he wasn't done yet. The car stopped, and the door opened. A figure stepped out, their silhouette dark against the streetlights. Who was it? What did they want? Jamal's instincts told him it was someone who had come to challenge everything he was about to do. The doors shut softly behind the figure, the tension palpable in the air. The figure stepped closer, and Jamal's eyes narrowed as he scanned the silhouette against the faint streetlights. His pulse quickened, his body tensing instinctively. Who could this be? It was late, and no one was supposed to be here. He had just talked to Marcus. He was sure it was too soon for David to be back with any new updates. Jamal's instincts kicked in, preparing him for whatever might come next. The figure was tall, wearing a dark jacket that obscured their features. Jamal's hand instinctively rested on the doorframe, his mind racing. He had to be prepared for anything, but he couldn't let fear take over. He had fought through much worse. He wasn't about to back down now. "Can I help you?" Jamal called out, his voice steady but cautious. The figure paused for a moment before stepping into the dim light, revealing a woman. Her features sharp, her expression unreadable. She wasn't dressed like someone who was passing through the neighborhood on a casual walk. She wore a tailored jacket, dark sunglasses, and carried herself with an air of authority. But there was something else in her eyes, something that caught Jamal off guard. "Jamal Harris?" she asked, her voice smooth, but with an undertone of something he couldn't quite place. "That's me. Who are you?" Jamal's posture straightened. He could feel the tension building. The woman reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out an ID, flashing it briefly before sliding it back into place. "I'm Agent Olivia Cross. I'm with the Department of Justice." Her words were crisp, professional. "I'm here to talk to you about the incident that occurred earlier today." Jamal blinked, surprised. The Department of Justice? What did they want with him? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to shift, but he wasn't sure how they all fit together. "Why are you here?" Jamal asked, his voice calm but demanding. "What's this about? I already dealt with the police, and I've got legal representation. I'm not sure what you think you can add to this." Agent Cross took a step closer, but her movement was calculated, controlled. She wasn't threatening, but Jamal could feel the weight of her presence as if she was testing him, waiting to see how he would react. "This isn't about what happened today," Agent Cross said quietly. "It's about what comes next." Jamal's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She took a breath, exhaling slowly as if she were considering her next words carefully. "I'm here because the Department of Justice is monitoring this situation closely. We've been following the events that have occurred on your flight, and I have to tell you, this is bigger than just a simple misunderstanding between a flight attendant and a passenger." The words hung in the air, thick with implication. Jamal stared at her, his mind reeling. "Bigger? What are you talking about?" Agent Cross's face softened slightly, but her eyes remained intense. "The incident on your flight has sparked attention from higher levels of government. We've been getting reports about discrimination, racial profiling, and abuse of power by officials in this area. And frankly, your case has become a point of focus. People are watching." Jamal's breath caught in his throat. For a brief moment, he was silent, trying to absorb the magnitude of what Agent Cross had just said. This wasn't just about one racist flight attendant. This wasn't just about one isolated incident. This was something far larger. The kind of story that could ignite a movement, one that could change the way people thought about race, justice, and the systems that kept them trapped. "So what do you want from me?" Jamal asked, his voice quieter now, the realization starting to dawn on him. "What happens next?" Agent Cross tilted her head, her eyes studying him for a moment. "We want you to tell your story. We need to make sure it's heard, that it gets the attention it deserves. But more importantly, we need someone like you, someone with a platform, someone who's already seen the injustice firsthand, to lead this fight." The system won't change unless people like you step up and demand it. Jamal's thoughts were swirling. He had already faced so much in his life. He had fought for his country. He had fought for what was right. But this was different. This wasn't about just surviving. It was about fighting something systemic, something that had been ingrained in society for far too long. And the thought that he could be the one to lead that fight felt both terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. "And if I don't step up?" Jamal asked, his voice tense. "What happens then?" Agent Cross's expression didn't change, but her voice carried a note of urgency. "Then the narrative won't change. The people in charge will continue to operate without accountability. Nothing will shift. You have the chance to change that. You have the chance to make people see the truth." Jamal felt a fire stir inside him. He had seen the truth before, felt it deep in his bones. But now, the weight of that truth felt heavier than it had ever been. "This isn't just about me," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It's about everyone who's ever been treated this way. Everyone who's been left out. The people who never get to have a voice." Agent Cross nodded. "Exactly. And your voice is exactly what we need right now." Jamal took a step back, his mind racing. He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't asked to become the center of attention, to have his story become something that people would rally behind. But now, in front of him, stood a reality he couldn't ignore. He had a chance to do something, something that could bring real change. But he also knew the risks, the backlash, the obstacles. He would have to sacrifice a lot to make this work. For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. The streetlights flickered softly, casting long shadows over Jamal's driveway. In that moment, everything felt like it was in the balance. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Jamal said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I know it's not just about me anymore." Agent Cross's gaze softened, and for the first time, Jamal saw a trace of understanding in her eyes. "I know it's a lot to ask, but we can't do it without you. No one can." The silence stretched on for a moment longer before Jamal nodded slowly. "All right, let's do it." Agent Cross gave a small nod of approval. "Good. I'll make sure you're protected. I'll make sure this goes as smoothly as possible. But from here on out, things are going to move fast. You need to be ready." Jamal's chest tightened, but he stood taller now, his resolve solidifying. "I've been ready for a long time." "Was that?" Agent Cross turned and walked back toward the black SUV. As she climbed in, the engine hummed to life, and the vehicle sped off into the night, leaving Jamal standing on his porch, his thoughts still racing. As the SUV disappeared into the distance, Jamal stood there for a moment, staring at the empty road. His mind was already turning over the possibilities, the weight of what he had just agreed to pressing heavily on his shoulders. He knew this fight would be like nothing he had ever faced before. But just as he turned to head back inside, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from David, the lawyer. The message was short, but the words made Jamal's blood run cold. "The news is already out. They started spinning the story. We need to act fast." Jamal's stomach twisted as he looked at the message, knowing that his decision to step forward was just the beginning. The storm was coming, and he was right in the middle of it. The early morning light filtered through the blinds as Jamal sat at his kitchen table, his coffee cooling in front of him. His thoughts were a swirling storm of uncertainty, strategy, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. The decision he had made the night before was already beginning to feel like a weight too heavy to bear. He had committed to stepping up, to becoming a voice for those who had been ignored and silenced for far too long. But now, the reality of it was settling in, and Jamal wasn't sure he was ready for the fight that lay ahead. The quiet buzz of his phone broke his thoughts. He picked it up, seeing a new message from David, the lawyer. "We need to meet today. It's important. The media is breathing down our necks. We've got to be ready." Jamal's heart raced. He knew that the moment he decided to step forward, it would be all out in the open. The media, the public, they would all be watching. His story was no longer just his own. It was a symbol, a rallying point for so many others who had experienced the same kind of mistreatment. With a heavy sigh, Jamal stood up, grabbed his jacket, and headed out the door. He didn't know exactly what to expect, but one thing was clear. Nothing was going to be the same again. The small conference room was dimly lit, a stark contrast to the sunlight outside. David sat at the table, papers spread out in front of him, looking over some documents with intensity. As Jamal entered, David stood up and greeted him with a firm handshake. "Good to see you, Jamal. I'm glad you're here. We've got a lot to discuss." Jamal nodded, sitting down across from David. The tension in the air was palpable. There was no small talk, no pleasantries. This wasn't just a casual meeting. This was about the fight ahead. David wasted no time diving straight into the details. "We've been getting pressure from the media. Your story is already all over the news. The incident on the flight has gone viral. Some outlets are framing it as a racial profiling case. Others are calling it a miscommunication. But here's the thing, Jamal. The narrative is being shaped. We need to take control of it before it spins out of our hands." Jamal leaned forward, his gaze hard. He had seen the media circus surrounding similar cases before, how stories could be distorted, manipulated. He wasn't about to let his story become just another headline. "What do we do next?" he asked. David slid a stack of papers toward him. "We need to get you in front of the cameras. We need you to speak your truth, loud and clear. You can't just let them tell your story for you." Jamal looked at the papers, seeing outlines of interviews, potential statements, and media requests. "And what if it backfires?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "What if it only makes things worse? What if they twist everything I say?" David shook his head. "The only way it gets worse is if we stay silent. The truth is powerful, Jamal. But it's not enough to just know the truth. You've got to make them hear it. If we don't, they'll keep spinning their own version of events, and that's what people will believe. But if we get ahead of the story, if we control the narrative from the start, we can make sure the truth comes out." Jamal felt the weight of David's words. "So what's the first step?" David's eyes locked with his. "You speak, and we make sure the world listens." The following days were a blur of activity. Jamal found himself thrust into a whirlwind of interviews, statements, and media requests. The phone calls came nonstop, and he was suddenly at the center of a storm that he hadn't fully anticipated. Reporters called at all hours, each one trying to get the first exclusive, trying to capture his story in their own way. But Jamal remained focused, determined not to let anyone twist his words. He knew that every statement he made would be scrutinized, every word dissected. The first live interview came sooner than expected. A well-known news anchor had asked to sit down with Jamal for an exclusive segment. It was scheduled for the next evening, and Jamal had barely enough time to prepare. The weight of what he was about to do began to settle heavily in his chest. That evening, as the cameras rolled and the lights flickered on, Jamal found himself sitting across from the anchor, the studio lights casting a harsh glare on him. The interview began, and Jamal's nerves were palpable. But he had prepared for this. He knew what he wanted to say, and he wasn't going to let anyone control his message. "Jamal, thank you for being here today. We've all seen the footage from your flight, and it sparked a lot of conversation. Many are calling this a case of racial profiling. What's your side of the story?" the anchor asked, his voice smooth, but with an undertone of skepticism. Jamal took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had spent hours going over his thoughts, preparing for this moment. He knew the stakes were high, but he couldn't back down. "I've been silent for too long, watching other people go through this same thing. But when I boarded that plane, I wasn't a threat. I was just a man trying to get home. But Clara, she looked at me like I was a problem, like I didn't belong. And when I didn't do what she asked, I was treated like a criminal." He paused, his gaze steady as he looked directly at the camera. "This isn't just about me. This is about everyone who's been treated this way, everyone who's had to face judgment without being given a chance. The truth is, I wasn't the one who caused the problem. The problem is with the way people like me are treated in this country, before we even open our mouths." The anchor's expression shifted slightly, his professional demeanor faltering for a moment. "You're saying this is about more than just a single incident?" Jamal nodded firmly. "Yes. This is about a system that looks at people like me and sees something to fear. It's about a pattern of injustice that needs to stop. And it's about time someone stood up and said enough is enough." The anchor leaned forward, his tone softer now. What do you want people to take away from your story? Jamal's voice grew stronger as he spoke. I want them to understand that this is real. It's happening every day. And if we don't do something about it, nothing will change. But we can change this. We have to. The interview continued, but Jamal was no longer worried about the cameras or the lights. This was his truth, and he was making sure the world heard it. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for every person who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or mistreated. As the interview wrapped up, the anchor gave Jamal a final, solemn nod. Thank you, Jamal. Your story is important, and we're sure it will have an impact. Jamal stood up, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The fight wasn't over, but he had taken the first step, and it had been the right one. The next few days felt like a whirlwind to Jamal. The media coverage exploded in a way he hadn't fully anticipated, with news outlets picking up the story from every angle. Some supported him, others vilified him, but the response was clear. Jamal Harris had become a symbol. The narrative was shifting, but the pressure was mounting, and Jamal knew he couldn't afford to falter now. He had made the decision to stand up, and there was no turning back. It wasn't just the media that was turning their attention to him. It was the public as well. On social media, hashtags supporting him were trending, but so were those attacking him. It felt like everyone had an opinion, and while some praised his courage, others condemned him as an instigator. The weight of the situation hung on Jamal's shoulders like a heavy cloak. He spent hours with David, strategizing, discussing every angle of the public response. The media machine was relentless, but David had experience in these matters. We've got to stay ahead of the curve, Jamal. They'll twist your words if you let them, David had said, his tone serious. We need to control the narrative. We can't afford to let them define you. Jamal agreed, but even as they worked tirelessly behind the scenes, the truth remained. He wasn't just fighting for his own voice to be heard. He was fighting for those who had been silenced for far too long. And as the pressure built, it became clear that the battle wasn't just in the court of public opinion. It was about changing a system that had long ignored the cries for justice. One afternoon, after a long day of interviews and media briefings, Jamal sat alone in his apartment, staring out the window at the city skyline. His phone buzzed, interrupting his quiet contemplation. The message was from Marcus. Yo, check out the news. They're bringing in some serious reinforcements to go after you. Jamal's stomach tightened as he grabbed his phone and opened the news app. The headline made his heart sink. Veterans claim of racial profiling under investigation. Experts weigh in. The article went on to quote multiple pundits and experts who were questioning his allegations, some calling it a misunderstanding, others dismissing it entirely as a baseless accusation. The media was already framing him as someone who had caused a stir, perhaps even exaggerated the truth. He felt a mix of anger and frustration bubble up inside him. They're already trying to discredit me, Jamal muttered, scrolling through the article, his fingers tapping the screen with growing frustration. It's like they're not even listening to what I said. The phone buzzed again. Marcus had sent another message, this time with a link to a live broadcast. Turn this on. It's getting heated. Jamal clicked the link and watched the live feed. On screen, a well-dressed pundit was speaking, his tone dismissive. This so-called racial profiling case is nothing more than a misunderstanding. Jamal Harris is playing the victim, and some media outlets have chosen to amplify his claims without verifying the facts. This is not the first time we've seen this kind of narrative spun out of a simple passenger interaction. Jamal's fists clenched, his pulse quickening. The pundit went on, dismissing his testimony as if it was inconsequential, painting him as just another person looking to stir up trouble. The anchor chimed in, but the footage, the witness statements, and Harris's own words seemed to tell a different story. Could it be possible that this incident is indicative of a deeper systemic issue? The pundit scoffed. It's possible, sure, but without real evidence, Harris's claims don't hold up. He's a veteran, and we should respect that. But respect doesn't mean blindly believing everything someone says. Jamal turned off the screen, his anger boiling over. This is exactly what I was afraid of. They're turning the whole thing on me. He felt a pang of uncertainty, but then his phone buzzed once again. It was David. Jamal, We need to meet again. They're coming after you hard. But we've got a way to flip this. It's time to go on the offensive. Jamal exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. I'm not sure what more I can do. You've been speaking your truth, but now it's time to show them what's been happening. It's time to bring out the bigger picture. We've got a plan. Trust me. Later that evening, Jamal met with David in a nondescript conference room, away from the cameras and prying eyes. David was pacing as he outlined their next steps. We've got to take the fight to them, Jamal. The media can't ignore you if you make them confront the truth. It's time to gather everything. More witnesses, more proof, more stories of racial profiling. We need to hit them hard. Jamal nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation. I'm ready. Let's do it. The following days were a blur of phone calls, strategy sessions, and more media appearances. David had put together a comprehensive plan to counter the growing narrative against Jamal. They were gathering additional witnesses who had experienced similar treatment on flights, building a case that went beyond Jamal's single experience. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them. But even as they built their case, Jamal felt the weight of everything settling heavily on him. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. It was a fight against a system that would stop at nothing to maintain its power. One evening, as Jamal sat in his apartment, looking over the documents that David had sent him, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find a familiar face. Marcus stood in front of him, holding a small box. I figured you could use some backup, Marcus said, a small smile on his face. Jamal raised an eyebrow. What's this? Marcus handed him the box, and as Jamal opened it, he found a pair of military dog tags inside. I thought you might need these, Marcus said, his voice softening. You're not in this alone, man. We're all in this with you. And this fight? It's ours too. Jamal stood still for a moment, staring at the dog tags in his hand. Thanks, man, he said quietly. I won't forget it. Marcus gave him a nod of reassurance, then left without another word. Later that night, as Jamal sat back at his desk, the dog tags on his table seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. He didn't just have his own fight ahead of him. He had the responsibility of everyone who had ever been treated this way, everyone who had been silenced. He was ready. He had to be. The next morning, as Jamal prepared for another media appearance, his phone buzzed with a new message from David. We've just gotten word. Clara has filed a defamation suit against you. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. This was the last thing he needed right now. The fight had just taken an even darker turn. Jamal stared at the message on his phone, his pulse quickening. Clara has filed a defamation suit against you. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, the weight of them settling in as he tried to process what it meant. A defamation suit? Clara was fighting back now. And this wasn't just about a misunderstanding anymore. This was personal. He ran his fingers through his hair, feeling the tension tighten around his chest. He had expected backlash. But this was something else entirely. Clara wasn't just denying what had happened. She was going on the offensive, trying to take him down legally, to ruin his credibility. Jamal paced the small apartment, the room feeling smaller and smaller with each step. How could this be happening? Everything he had worked for, every moment of standing up for what was right, was being questioned, distorted. The media had already begun to turn on him, and now Clara, with her cold, calculated move, was going to try and make him out to be the villain in all of this. His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. David, we need to meet ASAP. This changes things. Jamal didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket, slipped his phone into his pocket, and left the apartment, his mind racing. This was bigger than just him now. This was war. David's office was a sanctuary amidst the chaos, a place where the noise of the world outside couldn't touch them. The walls were lined with books, and the heavy oak desk gave the room a sense of quiet authority. Jamal took a seat across from David, his jaw tight, his thoughts scattered. David wasted no time. Clara's move is strategic, David began, his voice steady. She knows the media is on your side for now, so she's going after your credibility. A defamation suit is a way to make you look like a liar. If we don't counter it, the narrative shifts, and we lose control. We can't let that happen. Jamal took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside his chest. What do we do now? I can't just let her get away with this. David's eyes darkened as he leaned forward. We fight back. We go public with everything. We show the world who she really is. Jamal's brow furrowed. What do you mean? How do we do that? David smiled grimly. I've been gathering information. It turns out, Clara's history isn't as spotless as she's made it seem. There are reports from previous passengers, from her colleagues. If we can get the right witnesses, we can expose her for what she is. Jamal's heart began to race again, but this time with a renewed sense of purpose. He'd been silent for so long, watching injustice unfold without saying a word. But now, it was time to fight back. So we fight her with the truth, Jamal said quietly, his resolve hardening. We don't let her bury me. We make her the story. David nodded. Exactly. But it's going to take everything we have. This is going to get ugly. Jamal looked out the window, his mind spinning. I've already lost so much, David. This is bigger than me now. I can't back down. David leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the desk. No, you can't. And neither can I. We've got a shot at making real change here, Jamal. If we fight this, if we win, this could set a precedent. It could force people to look at the way we're treated. But it's going to take everything we have. Every ounce of courage. Jamal exhaled slowly, his mind finally quieting for a moment. Then let's do it. Let's make sure people hear our voices. The next few days felt like a blur of interviews, witness testimonies, and media backlash. The news outlets, which had initially rallied behind Jamal's story, began to shift. Some pundits continued to support him, but many began to question the details. Clara's defamation suit had painted Jamal as someone who was fabricating his story. They were trying to discredit his experience, to make him out to be just another victim of his own making. But Jamal wasn't backing down. With David's help, they had assembled a team of witnesses who had experienced similar treatment on flights with Clara. They were ready to expose the truth, to show the world that Jamal wasn't alone in this fight. One morning, David called with a new development. I've got something big. A former colleague of Clara's, someone who worked with her at another airline, is willing to testify. She says Clara has a history of treating black passengers differently. This could be the break we need. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. This was it. Get them to sign on. Let's take this to court. The courtroom was a tense, silent place. Jamal sat at the defendant's table, the weight of the world on his shoulders. On the opposite side sat Clara, fatigued, unyielding gaze never leaving him. For lawyer, a sharp, calculating man, sat beside her, his eyes scanning the room with the confidence of someone who knew they had the upper hand. But Jamal wasn't afraid anymore. He had been through worse. He had stood up when others hadn't. And now, he was standing for everyone who had ever been in his position. He was standing for the truth. The trial was an emotional roller coaster. Clara's defense team hammered Jamal's credibility, questioning his version of events, trying to paint him as someone who had blown the entire situation out of proportion. They brought in character witnesses, portraying Clara as a hard-working, dedicated flight attendant who had done nothing wrong. The media watched closely, picking up every word, every gesture, ready to spin whatever narrative would get the most attention. But then, the tide began to turn. David presented witness after witness, each one telling a similar story. Passengers who had been treated unfairly, people who had experienced the same kind of dismissive treatment from Clara. The defense had no choice but to acknowledge the pattern, the undeniable truth that Clara had, in fact, a history of racial bias. And then, the final blow came. A former colleague of Clara's, a flight attendant who had worked with her for years, took the stand. The woman's testimony was damning. She spoke of Clara's behavior behind closed doors, of her prejudiced remarks, of the way she treated black passengers. The courtroom fell silent as the woman's words echoed in the air. Clara's defense team tried to discredit her, but it was too late. The truth had been exposed. That evening, as Jamal sat in his apartment, watching the trial coverage on TV, he felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief. The battle was far from over, but today had been a turning point. The world was beginning to see Clara for who she really was, and Jamal was no longer just a passenger on a plane. He was the voice of change, of justice. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus. "You did it, man. The whole world's watching. You've made it impossible for them to ignore the truth." Jamal smiled, but it was a weary smile. It's not over yet. There's still a long way to go. But as he sat back in his chair, the weight that had been pressing down on him for so long finally began to lift. He had fought for the truth, and he had won the first battle. And for the first time in a long while, Jamal felt like maybe, just maybe, there was hope for real change. As Jamal leaned back, the phone buzzed again, this time with a news alert. His eyes widened as he read the headline. "Clara found guilty of racial discrimination. Landmark case sparks nationwide debate." The next few days felt like a blur for Jamal. The news of Clara's guilty verdict spread like wildfire across the media. The headlines screamed in bold letters, and the case became a symbol of racial injustice within the airline industry. It was a landmark case, one that would change the way the world looked at racial profiling on flights. But for Jamal, the victory didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning of something much larger, something far more daunting. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The media storm, the public scrutiny, the pressure to keep pushing forward, it was all just beginning. But one thing was clear: Jamal had made a difference. His decision to stand up had forced the world to pay attention. That night, as he sat in his apartment, watching the news coverage of the verdict, Jamal's phone buzzed again. The message was from David. "We've got some movement on the corporate side. The airline is making changes, but it's not enough. We need to go after the people who let this happen." Jamal's stomach tightened as he read the message. The people who let this happen. He knew exactly who David was talking about. The airline wasn't the only one at fault. It was the whole system, the system that had allowed Clara's behavior to continue unchecked. Jamal had fought for his own dignity, but now, it was time to fight for accountability. Real, systemic change. Jamal took a deep breath and replied, "I'm in. Let's finish this." The following morning, Jamal met with David again. This time in a sleek conference room filled with stacks of legal documents and research. The air was thick with anticipation. The case had won. But now, they had to keep pushing. David sat across from him, his face serious. "We've got a chance to hit them where it really hurts. If we can show that this wasn't just Clara's behavior, but a culture within the airline. Something deeply ingrained in their training, their hiring practices, their management, we can force real change." Jamal nodded. "How do we do that?" David pushed a stack of papers toward him. "We've got documents that show a pattern of racial discrimination in other areas. It's not just Clara. It's the way they've treated black employees, the way they've handled customer complaints about racism. If we can get the right people to speak out, we can build a case that will force the airline to make real, lasting changes." Jamal's heart raced as he looked through the files. He had always known that this wasn't just about Clara. It was about a system that had been built on biases, on fear, and on the constant mistreatment of people who looked like him. And now, they had a chance to break that system open. "This could be the fight of a lifetime," Jamal said, his voice steady but full of determination. "But we can't do it alone. We need more people, more voices. This isn't just my fight anymore." David gave him a knowing look. "You're right. We need allies. People who have seen the same things. People who have been through it." Jamal nodded. "Let's do it." Over the next few weeks, Jamal and David worked tirelessly, gathering testimonies from former employees, customers, and other flight attendants who had witnessed or experienced the same kind of discrimination that Jamal had. They dug through company records, looking for evidence that could prove this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger, more insidious culture within the airline. Then came the breakthrough. A whistleblower, a senior manager within the airline, came forward. This individual had worked in a high-level position for years and had witnessed the systemic racism firsthand. They had kept records, documented incidents, and had been waiting for the right moment to speak out. That moment had finally come. Jamal sat across from the whistleblower, his heart pounding as they spoke. "I've been watching this for years," the whistleblower said, their voice low but filled with conviction. "I couldn't stay silent any longer." "What happened to you, Jamal?" "That was just the tip of the iceberg. The way they treat their black employees, the way they handle complaints, It's all part of the same culture. It's not just one bad apple. It's the whole tree. Jamal felt a rush of emotion. This was it, the evidence they needed, the proof that this wasn't just an isolated issue, but a deep-rooted problem within the system. What do we do now? Jamal asked. The whistleblower handed him a folder, thick with documentation. You take this. You make sure the world sees it. The case against the airline was now ready to go public. Jamal knew that everything had led to this moment. The media would be watching. The world would be listening. But this time, Jamal wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for every person who had been mistreated, every person who had been forced to remain silent. And this time, he was ready. The day the documents went public was a day Jamal would never forget. The headlines read like a story of revolution. Whistleblower reveals airline's racist practices. A culture of discrimination exposed. News outlets from around the world picked up the story, and the response was immediate. People flooded social media, sharing their own stories of discrimination and rallying behind Jamal. The tide had turned, and the world was finally waking up. But Jamal knew the fight wasn't over. The airline would fight back. They had money, power, and resources, and they wouldn't let go of their grip easily. But Jamal had something they didn't. He had the truth, and the truth was powerful. The next day, Jamal was scheduled for a live interview with one of the largest news networks. As he sat in front of the cameras, waiting for the segment to begin, the weight of the moment settled in. He had fought so hard to get here, and now the world was watching. His voice, his story, was no longer just his. It was a movement. The anchor greeted him, and the interview began. Jamal's answers were measured but passionate. He spoke about the systemic nature of the issue, about how Clara was just a small part of a larger problem. He spoke about the whistleblower, about the truth they had uncovered, and how it was time for real change. This is bigger than me, Jamal said, his voice unwavering. This is about justice. This is about making sure that the people who come after me don't have to fight the same battle. It's time to stop the cycle. It's time to take action. As the interview ended, Jamal felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. He had said what needed to be said. The world had heard the truth. But just as he was about to leave the studio, his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. It was a message from David. They're coming after us. The airline's not backing down. They've got something big planned. Jamal's stomach sank as he read the message. The fight had only just begun. What would the airline do next? Would they try to silence him? Or would they finally face the consequences of their actions?